Good evening, everyone. Tonight's discussion is about one of the most controversial issues in modern politics: demographic change, immigration, identity, and the so-called Great Replacement. Our purpose isn't to determine who wins an argument. It's to ask whether democratic societies have become so uncomfortable discussing demographic change that conspiracy theories have filled the vacuum. We've seen parties such as Reform UK and Restore exploit public concerns about immigration and identity, while critics argue that some of their rhetoric risks legitimizing conspiracy narratives. We also want to ask a broader question. Too often, debates about demographics are conducted without the people most affected by them. Muslims are frequently discussed as a demographic problem rather than as citizens, neighbors, and individuals. Jewish communities, meanwhile, continue to be targeted by conspiracy theories claiming hidden influence or secret control. If we're serious about confronting conspiracy thinking, both experiences deserve to be heard. Can we have an honest discussion grounded in evidence rather than fear? Let's begin with a simple question. Is demographic change itself something we should be talking about more openly?
Absolutely. Demographic change is real. Every country changes over time through births, deaths, migration, aging, urbanization, and economic opportunity. That isn't controversial. It's measured by national statistical agencies. Where we get into trouble is when people jump from "the population is changing" to "someone is secretly orchestrating ethnic replacement." Those are very different claims. I do think mainstream institutions have sometimes avoided conversations about immigration because they're politically difficult. But avoiding the subject doesn't make concerns disappear. It creates space for speculation, misinformation, and resentment. So yes, discuss it, but discuss it honestly with evidence and without turning minorities into symbols of national decline.
Soko, you've argued that establishment institutions have failed to have these conversations.
I think that's obvious. For years, if ordinary people asked whether rapid immigration would change their communities, they'd often be dismissed as ignorant or worse. Now, whether you like reform or restore or not, they've recognized that millions of people wanted that conversation. The mistake wasn't necessarily immigration. The mistake was pretending people couldn't notice change. If politicians say nothing is happening, while schools, neighborhoods, and census data show visible changes, trust collapses. Once trust collapses, people stop believing institutions about anything. That's where conspiracy theories grow.
That raises an interesting question about democratic culture. History suggests that some of the most important social reforms began with conversations that many people initially considered too uncomfortable to have. Domestic violence, for example, was once widely regarded as a private family matter. Survivors were expected to remain silent. As campaigners, researchers, and victims brought the issue into public view, societies introduced stronger legal protections, better policing, refuges, and support services. The early years of the HIV/AIDS epidemic provide another example. Fear, stigma, and misinformation often prevented honest public discussion. Greater openness about transmission, prevention, and treatment helped reduce stigma, encouraged testing, and ultimately saved lives. Mental health followed a similar path. Depression, anxiety, and trauma were once hidden because people feared shame or discrimination. Public discussion helped normalize seeking treatment and encouraged governments to invest more seriously in mental health services. In each of these cases, progress didn't come because every public concern proved correct. It came because difficult questions could be discussed openly, evidence replaced speculation, and the voices of those most affected became central to the conversation. Perhaps demographic change deserves the same approach. Not silence, not panic, but evidence, openness, and respectful debate.
I think that's an important distinction. People shouldn't be told they can't discuss immigration. But I'd separate two issues. One is whether immigration levels should change. That's legitimate politics. The other is whether demographic change proves a coordinated conspiracy. That's a very different claim, and the evidence matters. My concern is that economic frustration often gets redirected toward immigrants instead of housing policy, labor exploitation, or stagnant wages. If governments refuse to solve those problems, people naturally search for explanations.
But Anna, people don't search for explanations in a vacuum. They search because institutions often appear unwilling to acknowledge obvious realities. When citizens say, "My town has changed dramatically over 20 years," they're frequently told they're imagining things. They're not. People can observe change. The problem is that too often public debate has treated any discussion of national identity as illegitimate. That has allowed parties like Reform and Restore to present themselves as the only people willing to say what everyone else is supposedly afraid to say. Whether you support those parties or not, that's politically
I'd
significant.
add another dimension. Elites often benefit when politics becomes entirely about identity. If working class communities are arguing about race instead of housing affordability, wages, or health care, powerful interests aren't under much pressure. So yes, demographic change deserves discussion, but we shouldn't pretend economics suddenly stopped mattering. Migration doesn't occur independently of labor markets. Governments make choices, businesses lobby, workers respond. Those structures deserve as much attention as cultural change.
I also think we need to broaden the frame internationally. Migration isn't simply a domestic policy issue. Wars, sanctions, climate pressures, economic inequality, and foreign policy all shape migration. If Western countries participate in conflicts that destabilize regions, migration shouldn't come as a surprise. That doesn't mean borders shouldn't exist. It means causes matter. Reducing every migration debate to culture misses much of the picture. I also think Muslims need to be central to this conversation because they're too often spoken about rather than listened to. When demographic change is framed primarily as a cultural threat, Muslims become the subjects of debate instead of participants in it. Yet many Muslims have personal or family histories shaped by war, displacement, or political instability. Their experiences help explain that migration is not simply about people choosing to move. It is often about the conditions that make staying impossible. Muslims are therefore in a strong position to shift the discussion from fear about demographics towards the root causes of migration. That means asking difficult questions about conflict, military intervention, unequal economic relationships, authoritarianism, climate pressures, and foreign policy, as well as domestic immigration policy. If we only discuss who arrives without asking why people are moving, we're having an incomplete conversation. Let's address the phrase, "great replacement." Miriam, why has it become so politically powerful?
Because it takes a complicated phenomenon and turns it into a single emotionally compelling story. Instead of saying migration results from dozens of political and economic decisions made over decades, it says there's one hidden explanation. Simple stories are attractive. Reality usually isn't. We should also remember that conspiracy theories have victims. Muslims become collectively suspected of being part of an imagined demographic project simply because of their identity. Jews, meanwhile, have for centuries been falsely accused of secretly manipulating societies, governments, and populations from behind the scenes. Those narratives are different, but they share a common feature. They replace evidence with hidden intent and transform ordinary people into imagined agents of a conspiracy.
But I think we also have to admit something. When institutions refuse to discuss uncomfortable topics, people naturally look elsewhere. Some of those alternative sources are excellent. Some are terrible. The answer isn't censorship. It's better discussion.
I agree with that. Democracy depends on people being able to ask questions. The challenge is making sure answers are evidence-based. If someone asks whether immigration has changed Britain's demographics, that's a factual question. If someone claims there's a coordinated secret plan to replace one ethnic group with another, that requires evidence of intent, not simply evidence that populations have changed. Those shouldn't be conflated.
And journalists have responsibilities too. If they refuse to report stories because they're politically awkward, audiences notice. Once credibility declines, people become more willing to believe alternative narratives, including inaccurate ones. Transparency matters.
Though transparency also means acknowledging uncertainty. Sometimes governments genuinely don't know exactly what long-term demographic outcomes will be. We shouldn't expect certainty where it doesn't exist.
And we should be careful not to assume demographic change automatically means social conflict. History contains examples of successful integration and examples where integration has been more difficult. Outcomes depend on institutions, economics, education, and political leadership. If we keep Muslims and Jews at the center of these discussions as people rather than symbols, we are more likely to resist both prejudice and conspiracy thinking. Perhaps history teaches us something important. Democracies are strongest not when they suppress uncomfortable subjects, but when they create the conditions for discussing them responsibly. The lessons from domestic violence, HIV/AIDS, and mental health are not that every public fear proved justified. They are that silence delayed understanding, while evidence, openness, and the inclusion of those most affected produced better policy, greater public trust, and more humane societies. Demographic change deserves the same approach. It is neither a forbidden subject nor proof of a conspiracy. It is a complex social reality that should be examined honestly through reliable evidence, historical perspective, and democratic debate. That debate should include questions about immigration, integration, and social cohesion, but it should also examine the forces that drive migration: war, foreign policy, economic inequality, labor demand, humanitarian crises, and climate pressures. Ignoring those realities leaves us with only half the story. Most importantly, the people whose lives are most affected should not be absent from the conversation. Muslims should be heard not simply because they are often the subject of demographic debates, but because their experiences frequently illuminate the global forces that shape migration. Jewish communities should also be heard because conspiracy theories have historically portrayed them as hidden architects of social change with devastating consequences. The challenge for democratic societies is not whether demographic change exists. It clearly does, as every society changes over time. The challenge is whether we can discuss those changes openly, accurately, and respectfully, distinguishing evidence from speculation, policy from prejudice, and legitimate democratic debate from conspiracy thinking. If we can do that, we are far more likely to address both public concerns and the underlying causes of migration without sacrificing either truth, social cohesion, or our shared democratic values.